Concepts and a stress test. Problematic experience, phenomenal reality, and the laboratory experiment. In the role of a scientist, it proved to be that in some cases it's particularly helpful to make use of instruments to arrange experimental test setups with which to conduct controlled experiments alongside a methodological underpinning and gather and analyze thereby obtained empirical data. If the scientific procedural work need to be objectified, carried out or reified into objects, performed at the most outset of the self of the scientist, so to say, really seems to depend on the branch, discipline, or scientific discourse that one chooses for conducting the investigation to partake in, or is obliged to do so for some reason or rather custom. Let's take the study of philosophy, media cultural or psychoanalytic theory, for example. A microscope can turn out to be useful for one's inquiry if the research one is conducting may pertain to some sort of historic documents, for example. But it is perhaps more likely one would hand over such a task, let's say an analysis of historic documents by means of spectral or chemical determination of the object, to an expert skilled specific to the task. Nevertheless, it could be that the thing or state of affair under consideration, for example a microscope, holds its very own research-specific interest that rather than being bound to some form of delegation act comprises a research field-related approach, for example the microscope, as a form of media. Let's say it may hold insights for an object study that can enrich or even substantiate the scientific work in the same way as an interview, an empirical experiment, a field study, or an on-site visit may do. That seems possible, but what researchers and scientific practitioners in these fields maybe to a greater extent will find themselves doing is the definition of terms, formation of concepts and argumentations with the support of a conceptual apparatus that may be newly developed or may be consulted in some other theoretical work. They'll be forced in a sense to refine concepts, put them into context and to make more precise statements. For example, a scientist has to think about what a good statement, a convincing argumentation is, and how or to what extent her explanation are capable of, or must at all compete with other opinions on this particular subject matter. That means with other scientific explanations with view on the same phenomena, problem, or question. The terms, definitions, and expressions, the text argumentation, conjunctive network, information structure or architectonic, the sources assemblage, the method of access, conduct and modus operandi, all these can be inscribed, developed and thereby supplemented, remembered and refined on and with the help of some sort of supporting material. For example, a computer, a notebook, paper or a blackboard. Precision, sensibility of contextualization, distinctness, clarity, and ingenuity, all these seems to be overall especially notional concerns, a matter or priority of language, one may say. Whereas for some discipline, language seems to be more of an auxiliary instrument or supporting measure, for others it's a primary basis of method. What happens now when a conceptual formation or a whole conceptual framework is taken from the philosophy auditorium to the neurophysiology laboratory and back, to quote the title of a short article from neurologists Neiva and Sergio Blumen back from 2002. In terms of a specific direction of 20th century philosophy called phenomenology, the question can be also posed inversely. Is there a problem in the laboratory? Would be one way of doing so proposed in 2018 by theoretical psychologist Alexander Wendt. If in the commitment to the laboratory, as he points out, all problem-solving behavior gets reduced to a cognitive mechanism, do we miss something, and what might it be that we may miss with regard to problem-solving behavior or our general dealings with problems? This is the entry point for Wendt's inquiring research concerning psychological phenomenology. And it is exactly this back and forth questioning that can be or can become particularly interesting with regard to the work of experimental psychologist Albert Michaud. Michaud's interest in philosophical works as well as cross-scientific border research gets evident in a text like The Psychological Enigma of Perspective in Outline Pictures from 1948. Michaud not only worked with experiments in his laboratories, but so he offers his readers illustrations and thereupon based self-examinations or introspection exercises, as one may call them. It's one of Michaud's main theoretical interventions, the experimentally tied or warranted by experiments insistence on the discreteness and originality of the attribute of realness, as Rainer Mausfeld puts it. The so-called, by Michaud, impression of reality renders it important in the ambit of the movement from the auditorium to the laboratory and back, mentioned in the beginning, to study what might be called an ongoing stress test of phenomena and concepts. Can a concept be tested like a thesis set out to be proven by experiments? Is there any difference between a concept and a hypothesis? Does any hypothesis need a concept? And hereupon one could further ask, what function do the insertions in the form of illustrations in Michaud's writing fulfill? How do they work and accompany or supplement the lab studies? In what way do they exemplify or demonstrate certain state of affairs, especially in direct comparison with the experimental studies Michaud conducted? Do they provide us with more or less reliable, profound, or precise extracts from reality, or is their status just a categorical different one? At this point, it is to emphasize that Albert Michaud was himself well aware that the question he raises about pictorial representations, perception, and the character, quality, or qualities of reality, of cinematographic projections, or the real in the image, all touches not only psychology, but philosophical dimensions as well. Actually, he first studied philosophy at the University Leuven. And now to quote him, "It relates to much more general problems of interest not only to psychologists but also to psychiatrists, and even touches upon the most subtle questions within philosophy, such as the origin of the concept of reality." 1. Preliminary considerations on the role of philosophy. What is philosophy? An obvious answer would be philosophy is the love of wisdom. Well, that's for sure only a translation of the literal meaning. So instead of answering the question what philosophy is, we should take seriously into consideration that this formulation is an elliptical one, a characteristic highlighted by philosopher Stefan Günzel, meaning an important term is omitted. As the full question should read, what is philosophy about? And philosophy isn't about wisdom as one might think, he says, because philosophy is something one needs a practice in to become wise. But what philosophy would be actually about is truth. For Günzel, that is not truth as such, that is the true concept, but philosophy would be about truth, thus about the claim of truth of various concepts on a particular subject matter. So philosophy has to do with concepts and is well known for having one branch, that is metaphysics, as a discipline dealing with questions of the liminal, and as such with concepts of the liminal, in the natural sciences, for example, the nature of space and time. Hence, metaphysics is in stark contrast to the analytical branch of philosophy, which is more oriented towards argument, strives of clear concepts, and is interested in logical and conceptual consistency and clarification. Hence, it comes as no surprise that some of the main exponents of latter rejected all metaphysical questions as meaningless. One could ask in this regard what metaphysics can learn in dealing with analytic philosophy. Does it have to think about the possibilities and limits of its force of expression, about the understandability of its vocabulary? On the one hand, it should give in, so the analytic claim, to the analytical insistence on precision and commitment to enable linkage and accessibility. On the other hand, it should allow, taught amongst others by Immanuel Kant, to refer to the status of its concepts as border terms. Border concepts that cannot be pressed upon conventional combinations of terms, but are nonetheless indispensable, because to go to the bounds of thought would belong to the nature of human reason. The question where from and what for the whole exists is a good and reasonable question, thought Kant, even if the answer to that question operates with terms that, as it were, must free themselves from the straight grasp. But Kant insisted that the critical turn was needed for doing any proper metaphysical inquiry in light of reasonable principles. So Kant tries to shed a light on the presupposition of thinking. And he came up in 1783 with his Prolegomena to any future metaphysics that will be able to present itself as a science, 2 years after his critical turn in the first edition of his Critique of Pure Reason. But as we ask concerning philosophy, so we could ask concerning metaphysics. What is metaphysics then about? Metaphysics is, as mentioned, precisely the branch of philosophy that examines the fundamental nature of reality, or the nature of nature, one could say, including the relationship between mind and matter, between substance or substances and attributes, and between potentiality and actuality. On a traditional conception, metaphysics aimed to answer in a suitable, abstract, and fully general manner two questions. What is there, and what is it? That is, whatever it is that there is, what is it like? The word metaphysics is derived from a collective title of the 14th book by Aristotle that we currently think of as making up Aristotle's Metaphysics. But Aristotle himself didn't know the word. Rather, he speaks of the branch of philosophy that is the subject matter of metaphysics, or he calls it first philosophy, first science, wisdom, theology. At least 100 years after Aristotle's death, an editor of his work, in all probability Andronikos of Rhodes, titled those 14th book Ta Meta Ta Physica, the after the physicals, or the ones after the physical ones, the physical ones being the books contained in what is called Aristotle's Physics. So why was a distinction necessary for or made by Aristotle? Clues hereon may be found in the historical origin of philosophy. 2. The birth of Western ancient philosophy. It's fair enough to say Western philosophy started from an urge of formulating questions concerning the nature of nature or the origin of nature. It was somehow neither sufficient for the people anymore to stick to the authority of the religion of their day, nor to explain everything important in terms of mythology. So it wasn't religious ideas anymore, nor that mythology could be held as their worldview of ultimate reality, or what ultimate reality may consist of. Rather, what distinguished the philosophers from others was their audacity in challenging the authority of the religion of their day and their reliance on empirical observation and sovereign thinking. These individuals composed the first philosophical works of the Western tradition, each providing their own full account of the natural world and the origin of nature. Now, this Greek word for nature is called physis, and though we translate that usually as nature, it meant more something like the coming forth of the natural world, its coming into being. And since they were concerned with the natural world and its origin, respectively with physis and its ground, the metaphysical ground of physis, they were called physikoi or physiologoi by Aristotle and Plato, the pre-Socratics, so the one concerned with physis. The first philosophers were hence also the first natural physical scientists. The birth of science and the birth of philosophy culminated in the same persons, the same people, while the separation between philosophy and natural science hasn't occurred yet. Now, the physikoi were the first to use intelligible universals as opposed to imaginative universals. Epic poets like Homer or theological poets like Hesiod made use of what Giambattista Vico calls imaginative universals. The physikoi started to use abstract concepts while using to some extent metaphors. But for them, metaphors in the sense of metaphorein, the verb is metaphero, could mean or can mean carry over, transfer or change, was a transferal or a transference or translation. In fact, Latin translation was used to translate metaphora as translatio, which means both translation and metaphor, a switch from proper to figurative, one could say. In the modern Greek language, metaphora also means transport or transportation. Intelligible universals, so indeed abstract concepts, were primarily used by the physikoi to speak about the most far-reaching ideas and speculations articulated at the time. To be sure, we do find use of metaphors and simile in the writings of the physikoi, but they are just that, they are metaphors and simile, not original disclosures of how things really are. It's poetic tropes they are using only as a kind of rhetorical figure to express philosophical ideas. Ideas that are indeed so abstract that they have to do hardly anything with anything sensuous or any image at all. In contrast to concepts like love or courage, we can think of Romeo and Julia, or Achilles from the Iliad, they are not concepts, rather they are particular persons that do specific things. But in order to have human intelligibility, for Vico, universals instead of just particulars are needed. Nevertheless, the first universals weren't intelligible one, Vico insists. not abstract concepts, because the first peoples, Vico believed, wouldn't think in those kinds of universals, rather in imaginative ones. The first intelligibility, as Vico suggests, is a poetic intelligibility. But why did philosophy and hence science begin? It may be because of Zaumatzin, a state of being in astonishment. It is accounted for as the fundamental pathos, feeling or state of mind of philosophy. So what was it that astonished these persons or thinkers? Well, we may encounter it in philosophical thinking, in what distinguishes philosophical thinking from, let's say, every other kind of thinking. It not only addresses ultimate or liminal questions that ask about first principles in biology, anthropology, or physics, but there is always a certain philosophical distance from the typical concepts or ideas of what one is actually speaking about. The philosopher is therefore perplexed where others may not be perplexed at all. In the philosophical stance, one is not asking for the common name of a certain matter. A certain uncanniness about the phenomenon appears. Disciplines like biology, anthropology, or physics never ask what life is, what human nature is, or what the ground of nature may be, because these kind of questions are not proper questions for or in respect of these disciplines. The key notions that made possible these disciplines, like bodies in motion, life, or human, these are the questions and problems that occupy philosophy, one could say. All disciplines carve out a particular region of being and inquire into that region, that is, what gives rigor to a discipline. But only philosophy questions being qua being. Now this may sound rather cryptical, but two things that it gives way to are not so cryptical at all. Firstly, philosophy, as far as it is concerned with presuppositions or the presuppositions of thinking, may aspire to be presuppositionless, that is, it inherits the stance of repelling fundamental principles, even truth itself. Secondly, it has no fixed definitions of its subjects. For Heraclitus, I am a philosopher. Philein to sophon means to be in favor of the sophon. Philia, philein, homolegein. To speak in the manner or out of correspondence, to be in harmony with the sophon, with the logos. Now this attunement or correspondence was a harmony or attunement with the sophon, the one or being. Within Plato and Aristotle, this attunement with became not a harmony, but one could argue became a hunger for, oraxis, a hunger for wisdom. Especially in the books The Phaedros and the Symposium, the philos is a yearning for, a hunger for beauty, and became with Descartes a quest for certainty, yes, a hunger for certainty. Now in Kant, it's a quest for critique of philosophical dogmatism that makes illegitimate claims that are with respect to Kant's critical standpoint unfounded ones. For Hegel, philosophy becomes a dialectical deduction, love of wisdom to science of wisdom. But why does this quest first start after the physics? Philosopher Nicolas Rescher distinguishes in this regard a conceptual approach, which he will also call epistemic or hermeneutic one, that would concern the mind and the world insofar as it is an object of understanding, and an ontological approach, which he also calls metaphysical or causal one. That would concern being and things in themselves. The title Metaphysics, after the physical ones, the books about nature or the natural world and its defining feature, namely change, also suggests that metaphysics is about the unchangeable. Now, if all reasons are to be sufficiently subsumed within a universe, one universe, metaphysics ask, must there be not something self-existing, self-sustaining about this universe? One such a candidate is held to be consciousness. For a depiction on what consciousness is about or consists in, one could think of three possibilities. One such a candidate is held to be consciousness. For a depiction on what consciousness is about or consists in, one could think of three possibilities. First, consciousness is purely physical and there's nothing left over to explain. Second, consciousness requires profoundly new physical laws. Or third, consciousness cannot be entirely explained within the physical, it must include therefore non-physical elements. This alleged surpassing of physics reveals itself in the metaphysical research procedure. Aristotle classified physics and mathematics as the same kind of sciences as metaphysics, namely theoretical, and regarded them as part of philosophy. In the metaphysical foundations of natural science, Kant asserts that every natural science necessarily implies a metaphysics of nature. Eigentlich so zu nennende Naturwissenschaft setzt zuerst Metaphysik der Natur voraus. And if natural science is an investigation of what is given in nature as such, as an object of experience, then, on the other hand, the metaphysics of nature concerns that of which the concept of nature in general consists, die Prinzipien der Notwendigkeit dessen, was zum Dasein eines Dinges gehört. That means, in other words, the conditions and presuppositions which enable science to study nature itself as something simply given. If, according to Kant, every natural science presupposes metaphysics of nature, what differentiates then philosophy from science? It's not possible to encounter nature in the natural world, so we have to bring this concept up somehow. Well, the special status of philosophy results from the fact that for philosophy everything, and that includes it itself, has to be clarified in its meaning. What philosophy itself is, what object it has, and whether it has one at all is questionable for philosophy. Why so? How could philosophy even think about the reason, the origin, or the principle if it had to make validity statements or requirements? And if it made up these eligibility requirements, wouldn't philosophy not end up finding exactly what it assumed to search? Precisely for this reason, Plato once differentiated philosophy from science in this respect. Philosophy, according to Plato, must be unconditional in its validity claim. Only then can it question the other areas of knowledge critically for their reasonability. 3. The slowly dissolving discomfort of two siblings in spirit. The development coming from surprising places. They are coming from all different places of information, computer and quantum computer science. For the most part, they are coming from condensed metaphysics, and they are coming from good old quantum mechanics, to quote Leonard Susskind. At the start of a lecture course entitled Inside Black Holes by Leonard Susskind, theoretical physician from Stanford University, he speaks rather astonished about the incident that newly development in terms of studying black holes are coming or are receiving important and stimulating impetus of what he designates as condensed metaphysics. As such, his surprise is concerned with the place of departure or the origin from where his field of study, namely mathematics and theoretical physics, take up new impetus for their cutting-edge researches. This surprise, expressed by Susskind, is somehow shared alike by Robert Wirch in a talk he held at a symposium on the philosophical dimensions of neuromedical sciences in 1975. Wirch contests a surprising attitude, even suspicion, when the neuroscientists hear that philosophical concepts should have anything to do with the pragmatic research of their subject, neuroscience. To quote him, the neuroscientists, on the other hand, might be puzzled by the question of the function of philosophical concepts for quite different reasons. The neuroscientists in neuropharmacology at the University of California Med Center, San Francisco, were pragmatic people. That philosophical concepts had anything to do at all with the pragmatic solving of the scientific puzzles that occupied their day-to-day life would come as a great surprise. Where does this great surprise that Wirch carefully attests to his colleagues in neuropharmacology may derive from? Wirch speaks about how the scientists are puzzled if philosophical concepts are even only considered in terms of solving scientific puzzles at hand in their day-to-day researches. To understand better why this effective surprise can appear as a surprise itself, we have looked into how philosophy started right alongside the natural sciences in a development that leads toward what in German implies a subtle dual notion of becoming independent and something like an internal communicative understanding, namely the successful striving for independence of the natural sciences, Verselbstständigung der Naturwissenschaften. This occurring shift, which Olaf Breitbach pinpoints to the end of the 19th century, however, doesn't free or release the sciences out of their historio-cultural context. As he writes in one of his articles, Schließlich sind auch die Naturwissenschaften Teil einer Kultur. Sie sind, wie alle anderen Wissenschaften, in eine Geschichte eingebunden, in der sie zwar mit Ende des 19. Jahrhunderts durch die sich etablierende, strukturell bedingte und methodisch diktierte Abgrenzung vom alltäglichen Sprach- und Handlungsraum zusehends autonom erscheinen, aber auch in dieser Situation nicht aus dem Gesamtkontext der sie tragenden Gesellschaft gelöst sind. Auch die Naturwissenschaften stehen in der Geschichte, auch sie sind Teil der Kultur. But against this conviction, the opinion sticks that all experience is dissolvable in experiment. Wherever the investigator comes upon experience, she may make scientific knowledge of it. The principles seem to say that all experience is of such a form that it can be made scientific. What can it mean to say that experience presupposes experiment, but not vice versa? That experiment may exist even in the absence of experience, to quote Thomas Cohen in his article Experiment and Experience. Against this understanding, especially the hermeneutic tradition, importantly Hans-Georg Gadamer, rebel. Die Erfahrung muss zuerst vom wissenschaftlichen Experiment unterschieden werden. Erfahren heißt nicht experimentieren. Das Experiment wird in einem Laboratorium nach induktiver Methode durchgeführt und es wird kontrolliert, verifiziert und bestätigt, bis zum Beweis des Gegenteils. Sein Erfolg liegt in der Bestätigung, die von der Möglichkeit der Wiederholung abhängt, in der jedoch jede Geschichtlichkeit abgeschafft ist. Die Durchsetzung des wissenschaftlichen Paradigmas hat die Erfahrung auf das Experiment heruntergestuft. An extract from Donatella di Cesare, Gadamer, ein philosophisches Porträt. Fourth, on the nature of concepts. First of all, we are indeed to get a grip on what we mean when we speak about philosophical concepts and about their distinctiveness. Can we also think of other concepts than philosophical ones? What makes a concept a concept? What is the relation between concepts and notions, terms? How do we come to concepts or notions in the first place? And what do we use concepts for? Can we evaluate them, and how so? And what role do concepts play in the sciences and the humanities? One of the foundational requirements of science, aside from explanation and intersubjectivity, is said to be rationality. This cornerstone of scientific inquiry is set out to the demand from all scientific research that the notions or terms, Begriffe, used in a given scientific argumentation must be defined. So scientists may put forth, formulate, in other words, questions, or what can be regarded as the same in this context, formulate certain kind of problem or carve out a problem and formulate a hypothesis with regard to this problem set out to be proven. It is in this respect that an assertion, a propositional statement, one wants to judge or assesses. Now, to fulfill the demands of rationality, a rational discourse, it is asked of the person, the researchers, scientists doing science, to define the notions or terms one is using in formulating, assessing, and judging scientifically. According to Aristotle as such, the highest task of the definition is to complete a scientific investigation and thereby establish the nature, essentia, of the objects examined. For the philosopher Heinrich Rickert, the act of defining is a designation or ascertainment of a term that is precise, as unambiguous as possible, whereby it is differentiated from other neighboring terms. To speak with Hegel, philosophy is essentially the work on these philosophical terms or notions. Philosophie ist Begriffsarbeit, or Arbeit am Begriff. One crucial part herein, what is the subject matter of a term or notion? What object does a term or notion have or designate? Was hat der Begriff zum Gegenstand? In other words, how is the relation of notions that we use towards what may be called in a Kantian sense its conceptual content? In a broader sense, this refers to the question of how we have access or stand into a commonly shared world that is ours and that we can speak and talk about and investigate in. Usually, what may come up in this context is the notion of experience. Experiencing something, experience, a verb and its noun form that we generally use for the rudimentary mediation between human and the reality in which they live. Now, the concept of experience has been closely linked in the history of philosophy to the act of judging or judgment. Experience thus seems to represent a basis for knowledge, or the basis for knowledge. Herein we discover an epistemological connotation, and according to Kant, empirical knowledge is precisely what makes up experience. Freilich ist die Vorstellung Ich bin, die das Bewusstsein ausdrückt, welches alles Denken begleiten kann, das, was unmittelbar die Existenz eines Subjekts in sich schließt, aber noch keine Erkenntnis desselben, mithin auch nicht empirische, das ist Erfahrung. Is then any experience experiment? Especially when it comes to experiments, we consider their function. We can ask for the relationship between our practices and how we perceive the world. How is it that we organize our manifold of senses and a manifold of intuition? And how do they operate in the medium of perception? Well, we're holding a space of some kind where things can appear, yes, but how are we creating a space where something like attention can happen? With Kant, one could say we're moving away from simply studying experience as it appears to us, or as we may reflect upon it, towards experience as it is construed by the faculties we bring to bear on it. This new science that Kant calls transcendental does not deal directly with objects of empirical cognition, but investigates the conditions of possibility of our experience of them by examining the mental capacities that are required for us to have any cognition at all. So, we are trying to get behind experience in a way to its sources, to its constitutive factors, to the way experience is made to appear for us as such. In other words, Kant is highlighting that the type of experience one is capable of having is related to the structures or capacities of the person having the experience, moving beyond perception to the structures, faculties, and abilities that bring them about. The faculty of sensibility is receptive, causing sense impressions, sensible representations, while the understanding is involved with concepts and discursive thinking. For sensibility is taking in sense data as things happen. The understanding and its capacity of spontaneity is kind of organizing the meaning of these events in a way that isn't determined strictly by the sense apparatus. As explicated by Kant in the above-cited passage, our capacity for cognition is, in its understanding, dependent on both intuition and concepts, sensibility and understanding. Now, sensibility translates to Sinnlichkeit, which designates roughly the ability to have intuitions. It's contrasted in Kant with the understanding, which names the ability to have and employ concepts. Sensation, however, translates Empfindung and means roughly what it does in English, the stimulations of one's senses by the real presence of an object affecting them. Intuition, Kant says, is the immediate relation of cognitions of objects. It takes place only insofar as the object is given to us. Its being given presupposes a receptive capacity on the part of the subject. It is only possible to man, at least insofar as the mind is affected in a certain way. This capacity is entitled sensibility and is one of two sorts of representations, that which is presented to sensibility by means of sensation, which we synthesize to form experience. They are connected with sensibility. Concepts are instead another sort of representation. They are connected with the understanding. Through intuitions, objects are given to us by means of sensibility. Intuitions rest on affections. Objects affect our mind in a certain way, in which we are receptive. In us are produced then sensations which supply only the matter of the phenomenon. So far for Kant. This matter, which Kant says, is that in the appearance which corresponds to sensation that is presented in sensibility acts on the subject. It affects the subject who is receptive to it. Now there are laws, says Kant, of sensibility, which presumably limit our possible experience according to the way in which we are receptive. That should mean which determine laws of intuition. So which intuitions are possible for us, and they must fulfill certain laws. Thus, the sensibility is one source constituting our ability to make and have representations. The other is the understanding, that is, both supply the limits of our possible experience. For Kant, representations which contain sensation are empirical. But some intuitions are not connected with affects and sensation. Rather, they are pure intuitions, Kant insists. And as pure intuitions, they contain the form under which something is intuited. For us, space and time would be such pure intuitions. These were a priori conditions of our sensibility which determine exactly how we are receptive to affections. So there is further some activity exerted at the level of the aesthetic, namely there is the active imprinting of the forms of space and time on its matter. This sensory matter receives the form of space and time, which turn it into a phenomenon. Kant's idea is that objects are given through the sensibility in intuitions. They are thought through the understanding qua concepts, and our experience of them comes from judgments, which involve the synthesis of intuitions and concepts in the unity of a perception. So the subject is the active pole, one could say in Kant. Kant argues that science is entitled to rely on certain principles that regulate its project, without being, and possible can be, after all, known as objects. Objective knowledge in Kant's sense is knowledge of a public world, a world that must be identical for every consciousness. And now comes the crux. In order to be self-conscious, I cannot be wholly absorbed in the contents of my perceptions, but must distinguish myself from the rest of the world. But if self-consciousness is an achievement of the mind, then how does the mind achieve this sense that there is a distinction between the I that perceives and the contents of its perceptions? According to Kant, the mind achieves this by distinguishing representations that necessarily belong together from representations that are not necessarily connected but are merely associated in a contingent way. To provide us with objective representations, that is, knowledge, all the synthesis activities must reproductively synthesize according to a rule. This rule determines how the apprehended and reproduced representations should be transposed into an image. Now, being conscious, consciousness in turn, generally refers somehow to knowledge. Basically, that I am aware of something means that I have recognized, represented something, know something, etc. Within the concept of knowledge, there's a relationship between a subject who has knowledge of an object, whereby a propositional structure, I know that, of knowledge appears. In terms of knowledge, philosophically wise, most persisting effects show Plato's understanding that knowledge is true, justified opinion, and the elaboration of Thomas Aquinas, who regard or understand knowledge as adequatio, thus as a match of the intellect in the sense of knowledge and the object that is to be known. In this sense, knowledge can be understood as the mediated relation of a knowing subject and the known object. This mediation must meet the criteria of general validity and the possibility of verifiable justification. Because knowledge can only be spoken of if it is in principle accessible to everyone, and for every knowing subject with regard to the object of knowledge, there is secured identical content that can be substantiated in reasonable terms. Knowledge is therefore demanded to be based on a necessary and not a coincidental connection that can be cited as the reason, the ground for it. This understanding of the essential structure of knowledge is generally based on the thinking of Aristotle, who argues for the identity as the unity of being, freedom from contradictions, and precisely the ground as the determination accounted for in terms of knowledge. After all, science refers to the fact that something should be determined, specified or proven via or qua this experiencing movement, experiences, namely knowledge. Phenomenology is in this sense meta-epistemology. Since Immanuel Kant in particular, the object, der Gegenstand, has been understood as a designation for everything outside that confronts the subject as a knowing I. This makes it difficult to distinguish between similar terms such as thing, Ding, matter, Sache, subject, Objekt, or an entity, Entität. For Kant, all of these terms can justifiably be gathered under the notion of object, Gegenstand, because of their all-uniting relativity structure, as they are all objects for the subject. If one looks into the work of Kant for the specific sense of experience in the context of the subject-object relation, one finds hereafter a peculiar thought movement at the beginning of which a dilemma gets evident. Das erlebende, wahrnehmende und erkennende Subjekt, Ich, muss immer schon ein Gegenstand unseres natürlichen Wissens oder bestimmter Einzelwissenschaften sein, damit man den Subjekt-Objekt-Ansatz überhaupt aufrechterhalten kann. Dass aber dann das Subjekt ein Objekt wird, wie ein anderes Objekt auch, und in dieser Fixierung fundamental philosophisch bedeutungslos ist. The alleged subject-object relation is only conceivable as though a distinction between two or more relata is already made, established and determined. This presupposition may include the dualism of inside and outside, a dualism of mind and matter, of state of consciousness and objective reality, of outer world and inner experience. And it may well contain the assumption that one side of the dualism, the person's state of consciousness, the experience of the other side, things of the outer world, represent. What it does is to relate the states of consciousness gained through introspection to the things of external reality that has been experimentally varied. The subject of psychology is within this area of consciousness and related to the physical world through a parallelistic series which is referred to as the area of external reality. This is resulting in a representational theory, picture theory of knowledge. If knowledge is conceived as a representation of the world in the ego, information is ultimately only an evaluation of the impression of the world in a consciousness. In this constellation, subjectivity, the subject of knowledge, is closed on identity. Der Gebrauch von grundlegenden Gegenstandsbegriffen, also Kategorien, seinen Ursprung im Ich-Denke-Bewusstsein und dem darin eingeschlossenen Identitätsgedanken hat. Kant distinguishes between empirical and transcendental consciousness. Empirical consciousness alone, although it accompanies different conceptions, is not yet sufficient to enable systematic cognition. It can be in itself scattered and unrelated to the identity of the subject, Kant says. By asserting this, Kant opens up a discussion with the empiricists who consider the fact, Ich denke das, I think that, P, the sufficient condition of cognition. His necessary condition of systematic cognition, the transcendental unity of apperception, can be summarized as follow. Ich denke das P. I think that P. This formulation explicates the self-reflexive structure of the transcendental unity of apperception. This structure does the following. On the one hand, individual acts of thought can only be systematically ordered into a unit under the condition of the existence of such a structure. The unity of cognition and systematic thinking thus only exists correlatively to the unity of self-consciousness. On the other hand, the structure of self-reflexivity contains in itself the structure of objectification. It therefore represents the condition of the possibility of objectifying thinking. The primary thinking activity of humans as self-reflexive beings can be seen in the objectification of the world. The objectification of the object is saved in Kant through the categories of the subject. This means, first of all, that the world does not merely confront the human subject, situatively and associatively, but as a coherent and enduring whole. Being an object means tearing apart the web of subjective sensations and perception and necessarily becoming universally valid for human beings. Already the Kantian term of experience expresses the idea of the world as an objective one. We aren't totally absorbed in a world, and by distinguishing ourselves from the objective world, we become aware of us. Das Bewusstsein enthält wesentlich einen Selbstbezug. Es ist die höherstufige Vorstellung eines Vorstellungszustandes erster Stufe, der wiederum ein Objekt als seinen Inhalt hat. Da dieser Vorstellungszustand erster Stufe bei den Menschen wesentlich eine Relation der Repräsentation zwischen dem Subjekt und einem Objekt ist, enthält das Bewusstsein unzertrennlich einen Bezug auf das Subjekt. Kant's theory of experience comprises two parts, transcendental aesthetics and transcendental analytics. In these, he examines the specific a priori form of human sensuality and human understanding, which he understands as conditions of the possibility of experience, which are at the same time the conditions of the possibility of the objects of experience. The paradox of this approach consists in the fact that the object to be known is first constituted or guaranteed as an object of knowledge in the process of knowing. The knowledge of objects is thus made dependent on the ability to think objectively. This means nothing other than that we have the ability to imagine the world as a world consisting of things that are independent of us. However, as pointed out before, the objectivity of the descriptions of this world turns out to be subject-relative. Expressed in Kant's terminology, the world is thing in itself and at the same time appearance. Dieses Bewusstsein meines Daseins in der Zeit ist also mit dem Bewusstsein eines Verhältnisses zu etwas außer mir identisch verbunden. Und es ist also Erfahrung und nicht Erdichtung, Sinn und nicht Einbildungskraft, welches das Äußere mit meinem inneren Sinn unzertrennlich verknüpft. Denn der äußere Sinn ist schon an sich Beziehung der Anschauung auf etwas Wirkliches außer mir. Und die Realität desselben zum Unterschiede von der Einbildung beruht nur darauf, dass er mit der inneren Erfahrung selbst als die Bedingung der Möglichkeit derselben unzertrennlich verbunden werde, welches hier geschieht. Kant argues that science is entitled to rely on certain principles that regulate its project without being possibly known as objects. Objective knowledge in Kant's sense is knowledge of a public world, a world that must be identical for every consciousness, for there are three factual assumptions that determine the logic of Kant's theory. The assumption of a world existing independently of humans, for which the label thing in itself stands. The assumption of the existence of the human subject of cognition, or the subject of knowledge, and the assumption of an interaction between world and human whose primary product is the world as appearance. It can be argued that phenomena are ontologically identical with things in themselves. Phenomena are things in themselves as they present themselves to us in experience, in dependence on our perceptual cognitive apparatus. The distinction between the things in itself and appearances has a methodological meaning for epistemology. In the further development of Kant's approach, one can speak of a numerical identity of the world as a thing in itself in the diversity of its possible forms of cognition as phenomena. In Kant, there is an objectively shared reality on the basis of which we can make true judgments. Since Kant, we have come to recognize every concept as a rule of judging or acting, a prescription for organizing the materials of experience. A concept as a rule of judging or acting is plainly subject to determination by the context in which the judgment is to be made or the action to be taken. Within the context, there is also a range of possibilities as to the specific function the concept is to perform, for instance, relating directly to the perceptual cues that call forth a certain response, or serving to select which among several subordinate rules of action is to be brought to bear. The descriptive concepts, explanatory ones, and others. Fifth, philosophical concept versus philosophical notions, terms, Begriffe. Since Socrates asked Thrasymachos for a definition of the concept of justice, philosophy posed for the very first time one of the most challenging philosophical questions: what is a concept? Philosophers have given many different answers ever since. Two dominant frameworks in contemporary philosophy propose that concepts are either mental representations or abstract objects. These views stems from two philosophical traditions, empiricism and rationalism. Empiricists argued that concepts are a sort of picture or image in the mind. According to this view, the concept of dog amounts to a mental picture or image of a prototypical dog. On the opposite side, rationalists argued that concepts shouldn't be understood as isolated mental pictures, but rather more like interconnected nodes in a massive inferential network. The rivalry between empiricists and rationalists derived from a previous and more fundamental disagreement about the very nature of thought and knowledge. For empiricists, having a concept amounts to having the capacity to perceptually recognize and classify objects by virtue of mentally computing all the perceptual futures that such objects have. For example, having the concept of dog and hence having thoughts and knowledge about them amounts to having the capacity to discriminate dogs from things that are not dog, based on the perceptual features that such objects typically have, hence its name. Empiria means experience in ancient Greek. For rationalists, on the other side, Or in contrast, having concepts involves more demanding cognitive capacities. This means the capacity to rationally draw all conclusions that inferentially follow from it. Currently, most discussions about concepts are framed within the cognitive science approach. According to this approach, minds are analogous to computers. Thinking gets often understood in these terms as computation over representational structures in the mind. This is the brain-computer analogy or metaphor. In the book Traveling Concepts, Mike Ball pleads for the distinction between a narrow denoting dimension of terms that they, following Nelson Goodman's language of art, refer to as labels, and an aspect that goes far beyond denotation, which she will call concepts. Both can be designated in German by the term Begriff, which makes the matter more difficult. The criticism that Ball here shares with Deleuze and Guattari isn't that there are or should legibly be concepts beside philosophical terms, but that philosophical terms are in their workings misunderstood and misused as if they label a narrow and clearly defined area, while in their function they would rather comprise concepts in a broad, almost dwarfed-looking or dwarfed-like spectrum of meaning. Such conceptual entities, suitable as Ball's title suggests, a tendency to wander through the problem areas and disciplines whereby something is always left behind and instead something new is collected or gathered. Deleuze and Guattari comment in What is Philosophy the same criticism, that there is no simple term. Again, the German translation must reproduce the French concepts with Begriff. But for Deleuze and Guattari, Begriffe are not defined because of their labeling meaning function, but by their components. They are a whole, but also fragmentary. Without the problems from which they emerge, terms would not make any sense. A term usually contains pieces or components from other terms corresponding to other problems and require other levels. The concept is incorporeal, although it incarnates or realizes itself in bodies. But it doesn't merge with the fact in which it realizes. The term says the event, not the essence or the thing. The concept is a genuine concern of philosophy. It would be an illusion to believe that the word Begriff used in German philosophy can simply be replaced by concept, Philipp Wünschner concedes. Deleuze and Guattari, who would differ from Ball for their labels, offer no substitute for the narrower understanding of concepts. Talking about concepts instead of Begriffe seems advisable from this perspective on concepts for Ball. Mieke Ball points out 3 points that are essential for her understanding of what a concept is. First, concept would work as a concrete problem solution rather than them to mean a perky sense. Second, they would be more objects of confrontation than application rules, for they can fail productively. And third, concepts are necessarily agile, they wander. The belief in the flexibility of concepts underlying Wünschner's analysis, he says, have nothing to do with a lack of precision. Concepts in their generative and structuring workings would have different effects on every field to which they are exposed, however, with shared characteristics. Unlike labels, which aim at identity, concepts would create the visibility of differences. In the following, we want to go in terms with the analysis of Philipp Wünschner and Mieke Ball in investigating if there's argumentative support for something like traveling concepts in the context of science. 6. Problematic experience and the laboratory experiment. In the German language, there are 2 notions in use for our phenomenal way of dealing or encountering the world. On the one hand, that is Erfahrung, experience, and on the other hand, it's Erlebnis. It may be translated as lived experience. The term Erlebnis evidently refers to our living partaking. Hereby the lived impression gets explicitly highlighted with the word Leben, life. In the philosophical discourse, Erlebnis has become a terminus technicus at the latest for Edmund Husserl. For Husserl, Erlebnisse are inextricably linked with consciousness. And for Husserl, in perceptual experience, what is perceived is identified as part of a tangible, natural, commonly shared and evidently given world. In the natural attitude, as he calls it, it isn't rather under doubt that what we perceive really exists. Now, the natural sciences in general and the neurosciences in particular are empirical sciences. That means their knowledge is based on repeatable, and this means observer-independent observation. These observations yet only become accessible to a researcher in some sort of experience. It is in this regard not enough if measurements are recorded by a machine. Only when these recordings are evaluated and experienced by a human being are they usable for further theory building. Likewise, another person communicating about the theory must first be heard and understood by myself so that I can have knowledge, apply it, and then maybe try to make use of it. All this takes place in experience. Now, even if the natural sciences could come up with a theory of experience, a somehow objective phenomenology that could explain experience within the framework of empirical knowledge, processes of the brain, neurological circuits, and so on, this demonstration would have to start nevertheless with the basic traits of phenomenal experience, because only these make further empirical investigations possible. So, in a scientific theory about human experience, it would have been to show conclusively how experience is constituted and how a theory is derived from phenomena of experience. Empirical science is in this sense an experiential one. In her book Die Experimentalkultur in einer Seifenblase, cultural theorist Anita Hosseini describes and analyzes in a somewhat genealogical manner how an experiential scientific stance became pertinent, taking off with Francis Bacon and his demand for an experimental basis for any natural scientific genesis of knowledge. She emphasizes how extracts from reality, formerly concealed, become or are rendered visible through the setup in the artificial situation of an experiment. She alludes further that the experiment, in its capability to transform the not yet known into an experienceable, more and more seizes basis in the acquisition of knowledge. Hosseini deals inter alia with Hole Rösler, who's asserting a prevalent culture of evidence in the 17th century, bei der die Wahrheit der Natur, die Ursachen der wahrnehmbaren Phänomene nicht logisch zu erschließen waren, sondern nur aus der Beobachtung zu gewinnen. Jedoch erfuhr dieser Evidenzbegriff eine Neubewertung, da in der Baconschen Experimentalphilosophie die Natur nicht nur beharrlich beobachtet, sondern auch bearbeitet werden musste, um eben diese Evidenz zu erzeugen. Hosseini pleads for an extension of the concept, begriff of experiment, into the field of experience. For experiment, understood as a basic activity of scientific practice in the wake of Bacon's experimental sciences, serves to deal with and investigate phenomena of nature and their properties. In experience, on the other hand, she argues the subject and object of the investigation would coincide into one. Through exact observation, the object of investigation is examined, but as investigator one would inscribe oneself into the realm of knowledge through the own subjective constitution, personal affection, and direct immediate attachment. In a different vein, Thomas Cohen cites his teacher, Henry Smith. There is nothing to be found in the meaning of experience that isn't already contained in the meaning of experiment. Experiment, Cohen agrees, is prior to experience in its very meaning and only come to be as experiment. If facts of empirical, logical or other statements are evident to us, then, as Wolfgang Stedtmüller in his book Metaphysics, Skeptic, Science argues, it is clear that this is not in the form and content of the statements. Both in the mathematical logical sciences and in the empirical sciences, the operative recurrence on evidence is unavoidable. It's hard to deny that such a statement is given for us with a somewhat certain evidence. But in the same way, things with evidence are given to us as objects, not only in scientific consideration, but also in everyday life. We experience things, certain objects, as somehow preliminary given to us. One can therefore say that evidence is experienced, that in the horizon of experience, the evidence sought is given. Evidence is not something that someone would have to produce first, but it is a basic experience that everything that is experienced is given directly to us with a certain evidence. This evidence given somewhat sticks to us. If something is given for me as an object with evidence, I cannot reasonably doubt it, because otherwise I would have to doubt any evidence, since no difference at all could be determined. It is evident to me what I see at the moment. It is evident to the scientist what her measuring instrument indicates. Following Edmund Husserl's phenomenological investigations, it is called experiencing something when an object is given to us with a certain evidence. The comprehensive horizon in which all experienced objects are given to us is analogously called experience. In experiencing, not only the sense of a subset of possible objects of sensual experience, thinking, remembering, and so on, is given with evidence, but experiencing encompasses everything that is given to me. Only in experience do natural scientists encounter the laboratory and everything in it. In the same vein, through experience we are given a world, a uniform, commonly shared reality, merged into an indissoluble connection. Experiencing, in the sense we want to understand it here, is supposed to make clear that there is a basic structure of human existence. This is, every subject should be able to comprehend this basic understanding of experience, if only it takes a close enough look at its own constitution. At the same time, it becomes clear why intersubjective understanding is possible only on the basis of experience, but why misunderstandings or incomprehension can occur as well and how these can be challenged. Likewise, an understanding of experience as a process that takes place directly in consciousness, in which the perceiving subject and internal as well as external objects of consciousness are coordinated, remains. This is a subjective category episodically linked to the moment of subjective perception. It is open both whether the experiencing subject performs this coordinating function and in what way this connection exists. This is, the understanding of experience holds the danger that the intellect, inescapable existence of things as certain objects of experience, is confused with the secondary performance of the subject. But this then leads again into aporia, that it cannot be stated how evidence is given independent of the arbitrariness of the subject. This is, how and where the individual has reliable access to reality. The phenomena that the respective science focuses on are given in, and so exclusively, in experience. No phenomena are known to us not revealed through experience of some form. The experience is the inescapable extreme, which is somehow the accessible at all. Thus, experience is the all-encompassing sphere in which every phenomenon takes place with which one is confronted, and thus also those phenomena which one scientifically deals with. This does not mean that there is no possibility to draw conclusions about things beyond the directly experienced, but it means that any theory and any knowledge about these things can be based exclusively on the phenomena of experience and must therefore be evaluated by whether it overloads, interprets given phenomena or suppresses, maybe doesn't even take into account relevant parts or moments of this phenomena. The concept of experience in phenomenology is also not about entering an indifference between subject and object, and thus falling back into psychologism, as this would disregard the possibility of deception. The concept of experience developed in phenomenology following Edmund Husserl is conceived rather as to clearly indicate both how and why we have a reliable access to reality, and how and in what way deception can nevertheless occur. Experiencing something denotes thus in the following that things of the world are given to us as certain objects and thus with evidence. Thus, experience includes everything that is experienced. In experience, the different perspectives of the sciences are tangible. Only from there they become understandable or comprehensible and can be made transparent for the respective other sciences. In experience, all phenomena are given that respective science take into consideration. Further, in experience, it is evident that evidence itself is not subject arbitrary to change, but pertain with a certain durability over time. In other words, the objects of experience follow a recognizable system which makes scientifically activity possible. The way I experience evidence and given objects correspond to a great extent with the way others do. In this shared experience, therefore, the evidence is given that evidence lasts, that one can trust the experienced evidence in a certain kind of sense, and that through evidence supra-individual reality is opened up, and on the other hand, that for us humans there is and can be no access to reality except through experience. Experience is moreover accessible and given in experience itself. This is, for the observation and investigation of experience, there is no need for yet another source of knowledge. But in experience, everything that can be known and thus also experience itself is given. This evidence can never be the subject of empirical study, but must always precede it as a prerequisite of empiria, in the sense of a pre-reflexive experience or practice given in evidence immanently to consciousness. 7. Albert Michaud, Phenomenal Reality on the Test Bench. Ein Wahrnehmungsbericht ist nach dem berühmten Philosophen Kant kein Bericht über die reale Außenwelt. Im Alltag sind hingegen fast alle Menschen eher gemäßigt kritische Realisten. Das gilt auch für die Wissenschaftler wie etwa Physiker, Chemiker, Bio- oder Neurologen. Ein Wahrnehmungsbericht bleibt hierbei immer ein Bericht über die reale Außenwelt. In the above-mentioned passage, the author gives an interpretation of Kant according to which our perceptual report about a real exteriority, real outside world, would never correspond to or consist of in an adequate manner with what is sought after, namely an observer-independent reality. Because everyday experience and the accustomed scientific attitude would not construe of the outside world as an epistemic or phenomenal beyond, he concludes that die Ergebnisse und Anwendungen der Wissenschaften machen es plausibel, dass die theoretische Erkenntnis nicht zwingend durch die Grenzen der unmittelbaren Erfahrung und den direkt wahrgenommenen Phänomenen limitiert wird. He argues that even if the Earth may seem flat, we know that it is spherical. And even if space and time may appear as distinct and independent, for us, experimentally backed up special relativity indicates that space and time are interwoven. Physical space perhaps shows up as Euclidean and static, while special relativity would show that it can be influenced by big masses, and new measurements confirm that large accelerated masses radiate gravitational waves that dynamically deform space itself. Hence, in conclusion, we would be capable of knowing more than we actually perceive, against Kant's proclaimed limit. This line of argumentation is not something completely new. Rather, the delineation of thinking and perceiving tend to converge at certain historical points, while in the interim phases they seem to diverge with an emphasis on one of them. While at the birth of modern science, for instance, these two forms of mental life were deeply interlinked, today they seem to be separated more than ever before, as a number of scientific crises have shown. Today, the doctrine of neural reductionism is the predominant official manner of scientifically integrating thinking and perceiving as central aspects of consciousness. But on closer examination, this kind of integration remains speculative in the sense of non-verifiable, since there seems to be no experiential bridge between the phenomenal properties of mental and neural processes which could be scientifically examined. In other words, this theoretical integration appears more as a separation because its thinkability implies its non-perceptibility. Reality as transcendence is only relevant insofar as it is experienced. And this experience may also be called, as Husserl does, its constitution. In order to know what reality is, reality in its sense must be presented in or for its experience. To quote Günther Figal in its article, Is There Really Something Outside? Doing phenomenology, we have to start from the lowest level of constitution and then work from the bottom up. In the logical investigations, Husserl understands the relation between acts primarily in terms of the notion of foundation, Fundierung. For instance, the act of feeling is regarded as a complex whole made out of different acts. The founding act is an act intending a single object. In order to feel something, we need first to have a consciousness of the particular object of our feeling. On the other hand, the founded act is the feeling itself. High-level objectivities are also grounded on given clusters of simple acts. From this perspective, however, there's no room for consideration of the constitutive effects that go the other way around. This is from the higher back to the lower levels of constitution. The latter would be more a concern for genetic phenomenology, which focuses on the history of experience and the temporal succession and intertwining of multiple acts. Diverse topics could be solved or addressed only by going into the genetic history of experience, for instance, the phenomena of language, consciousness, and especially the constitution of experiential types. Further, our expectations on the level of perception can be disappointed or frustrated. This points to the fact that we have usual expectations concerning certain types of objects, but these expectations may undergo a complete or partial delusion. This experience of delusion is illustrated by Husserl with the model of a fight, Kampf, between evidences. A kind of evidence is already there before actual perception takes place. It is the evidence of expectation that I already have before I am going to directly perceive the object itself or the currently unperceived side of the object. The evidence of expectation fights with the evidence of perceptions. Yet after the fight, the loser is still there. This means the evidence of anticipation is still alive and forceful, but its force undergoes now a modulation. I believed this object to be red, but it revealed itself to be green. This information is sedimented in my experience, as we are historical creatures. Everything we experience speaks about what we were expecting. In this way, it speaks about us, our subjective view and attachment to the world, with all its practical expectations, desires, values, and so on. For this reason, David Hume concluded that the proposition every event must have a cause can neither be proven by experience, because therefore one needed to observe all possible experiences, nor in virtue of the meaning of the terms involved. Hume suggested that there is no real causation out there in the world. But then again, how do we come to make these kinds of judgments that something had been caused by something else? In Hume, the human mind is contributing a great part in how we see the world by projecting structures into its occurrence. For Hume, we get in sense stimuli, sense data, and interpret these inputs, forming meaningful connections between what corresponds then for us to information. But this information isn't simply a bundle of facts about the world, but is rather truly conceived of by Hume as mind informed. Now Kant thinks that this insight must be expanded to all experience, because all experience is somehow like that we get in some unprocessed affection and then our minds applies concepts and creates the organized world as we see it. For Hume, it's conceivable that there could be acausal spatio-temporal events breaking into our reality, while this is for Kant precluded, impossible. Analytic meaning is derived from the meaning of the concepts involved. Kant came to the conclusion as such that all metaphysical judgments are synthetic a priori, meaning they are arrived at by combining and bringing together different concepts. The point about the Copernican revolution is that Kant thought that we could prove these basic propositions, at least these that underpin nature, if we go through that Copernican revolution and make the world to some extent dependent on our mind, rather than hope our minds will fit a world existing independent of us. The understanding is constitutive of experience by providing the a priori capacity to judge. By idealism, we may understand now, something about the world is dependent on the mind. Kant is an idealist about space and time, but there is something he's not an idealist about, namely that there is something out there. We don't bring the world into existence by virtue of thinking of it. We bring certain features or characteristics into existence, but not the very fact that we have a world to think about. Everything about our experience that isn't up to us is contributed by those things outside or apart from the mind. The noumenal ground, the manifold, might appear for us in space and time, but they don't become objects in space and time until the mind has also employed these concepts or laws that is in the mind to produce a fully determined spatio-temporal world. One of the trickiest things to understand about Kant is why he thought that it seems plausible that the mind does a lot of the interpretation of the information that comes in, and what we construct it and make sense of it with certain concepts. But why does he think that when the mind contributes a concept, that this means it is not in the thing in itself? All kinds of conceptual vocabulary that we use are eo ipso exclusively of the mind. So the only job for things in himself would be just to trigger our mind continuously into interpretative work. To the former, receptivity of impression, an object is given to us. To the latter, spontaneity of concepts, it is thought in relation to that representation as a mere determination of the mind. Intuition and concepts therefore constitute the elements of all our cognition, so that neither concepts without intuition nor intuition without concepts can yield the cognition. Coming from a neo-Kantian tradition, Albert Michaud's view on perception shares characteristic traits with Kant. Michaud emphasized that sensory input is not to provide material that can be combined, related, or even modified by certain psychological processes, predominantly under the influence of experience. Its role, on the contrary, seems to be confined to the triggering of endogenous constructive processes which obey their own laws of organization, are largely autonomous and independent of experience, and bring forth the edifice of our phenomenal world. The raw data of sensory inputs is held for triggering a phenomenological Kantian science. In sum, Michaud argued that the illusion of causality is constructed by our visual system independently of any prior knowledge. We perceive causality rather than inferring it. Consequently, Michaud regarded perceptual attributes such as causal or real, which have traditionally been attributed to interpretative and cognitive processes as being perceptually primordial and as immediate as, say, form or three-dimensionality. Michaud tells us the fact that an object is extended in depth or at least integrated within a three-dimensional space cannot be the distinguishing mark of its material reality in the visual domain. Then how is it that we can practically seamlessly differentiate between representations, let's say on pictures, and real-world entities? How do we manage to enact this intuitive character, providing us with insights in the character of unreality? In his phenomenological approach, Michaud attempts to study that which appears to us in the mode of reflection. In this vein, he comes to the conclusion that there is a real contradiction underlying the fact that although the image representation itself is flat, we are able to see volume in it. For there can be no question that we do see, not only interpreted, the depicted object as extended in depth, that there is the appearance of relief in a perspective picture, not an attributed character or impression of reality. Reality is in a sense conflictual for Michaud. To turn to another French philosopher, Henri Bergson. Henri Bergson diagnosed in Matter and Memory, in contrast to Kant and Michaud, the origin of the deadlock between materialism and idealism in the assumption of both that perception is a kind of knowledge. That is, a particular perception in its being a perception is already conceived of as an epistemic entity for an intellect. We see this in the empirical idealist sense data, information we receive via the senses, giving us the epistemological atoms to form into propositional knowledge, as well as in the problem of consciousness, the scandal of qualia as a kind of ephemeral, epiphenomenal knowledge based on assuming that sensory representation is informative in a speculative sense, whether that's in communicating facts about the environment to the organism, or whether it's raw data for a phenomenological Kantian science. With Bergson, we have highly differentiated understanding of perception, which we cannot go into detail here, but it's to stress that Bergson questions and shakes the most basic principles. We can ask us, how do science work in a positivistic sense? Well, they progress by elaborating the concepts. For example, Einstein gets to the forefront problems of his disciplines, physics, and what he sees is that he needs to change. We evaluate the sense of some foundational concepts, and by doing that he changes not only the concepts, and this is important, but the whole notion of physics with it. Because the concepts of space and time were so important for Einstein, was working on the problem at hand in physics. Was soll nun die Geisteswissenschaft den Naturwissenschaften vermitteln? Sie kann ja nicht vorbestimmen, was der Naturwissenschaftler sieht. Sie kann aber bestimmen, wie und aus welcher Interessenslage er etwas in den Blick nimmt. Dabei operiert Kulturanalyse keineswegs nur kritisch. Sie kann vielmehr ein Problem in neuer Weise feingliedrig auflösen. I would agree that the humanities, the study of the forms and formations, arrangements and figures, appearances and organizations of spiritual life, and this means historically and culturally developed ways of being in the world, structure problems in new ways by bringing into view the conceptual development in terms of the side of science, as Reinhard Breitbach argues. But so do they by necessity re-articulate what a problem is and how it is problematic and consequently for whom in the first place. And precisely in their role and functioning, they stress tests, concept and leverage them to travel.